Good morning and welcome to the live program at the Sci-Fi Library. This is Rachel Hugenberg. I'm one of the hostesses today, and I'm also a presenter today along with the fantastic children's specialist, Leah Stark. And the two of us, we've had a few conversations. We are both big tea nerds. So there are many beverages out there, but tea is both a favorite of ours. So I kept wondering, because as I said, I like to know the history and the background of things. What is it about tea? Like, what is the actual background about it? And it actually has a really weird and quirky story. All right, can you all see the slides? Yes? Okay, we're still recording. So we've decided to call this It's My Cup of Tea: War, Trade, Botany, and Brewing. So while we don't necessarily always think about it, tea is a multi-billion-dollar business. In 2014, it sold $90 billion. And that's actually a business on the rise. Surprisingly, you would think coffee was the world's second drink, but it is not. Tea actually is the world's second drink. It comes after water and then is followed by coffee and chocolate and soda. Tea's been known for a really long time to have been advertised for its medicinal properties. So I think you all and I have all seen the many different types of health teas. My favorite brand of those is Yogi, but other people have their personal favorites as well. And it's been used as a weight loss method. It's a cultural and spiritual staple in a broad variety of countries in Britain and any place that was a British colony at some point, with the distinction of the United States. It is actually a meal of its own. It's a ceremony, and it's a huge cornerstone of world trade. So we know that coffee and chocolate both come from beans, but tea is a little bit different. It comes from a plant. So there's two different kind of main species that we consider tea, or that tea snobs consider tea, which are the Chinese tea bush, which you can see here at the top, and the Indian tea bush. So if you've heard of Assam, that is specific to India, and it has a broader leaf and a much more bitter, darker flavor. Chinese tea is considered a little more delicate and a little lighter, but the weird thing is, they're the same plant. And it took about maybe 50 years to figure it out, because the history of tea with the British, there was a point where they were trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to call all these plants and animals, right? This guy called Carl Linnaeus starts coming up with a system. And he originally thought, okay, green tea and black tea are different things. They thought that Assam was a different thing from the Chinese tea plant, and it's not. The weird thing is, because tea originates in a little jungle, sort of mountainous region in between China and Nepal and India, different variations of the tea plant exist. Now here we can see the Latin name, Camellia sinensis. The weird thing is that wasn't its original Latin name, and it has no relation to the camellia flower at all. They just named it camellia because it sounded more fancy than what Linnaeus called it, which was te sinensis, or tea. Okay, so like we said, it originated in the Himalayas. Originally, it wasn't drank. It wasn't a beverage. It was a medicinal herb that you ate, or sometimes you wrapped your fish in it, or sometimes you chopped up your butter or your yak fat or whatever you had, along with some salt and pepper, and you ate it that way. So it was an herbal supplement, and then later on it became a beverage. Now I have a hard time imagining eating tea with butter, but actually in some mountainous regions of Nepal, that's still how they eat it, is with yak butter. Tea has some weird origin stories, and they're some of them a little gruesome. So the first guy here in the red cloak is the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma, which it makes sense. that a Buddhist monk would feature in one of these legends, because tea actually traveled with Buddhist monks across India and East Asia and Asia proper and Japan, and that's how it actually got disseminated, was Buddhist monks were taking it with them because tea was considered a form of meditation and still is. So this particular Buddhist monk, Bodhidharma, was doing a lot of traveling. He traveled for, I think, almost 9 years maybe, and he fell asleep by a river for 7 days. And to scold himself when he got up, he ripped off his eyelids, saying, "I will never fall asleep again." Very dramatic. And the eyelids fall on the ground, and they became the tea plant. Like I said, a little gory there. But gotta respect the man's dedication to his religious calling. So, Buddha has a similar story in other parts of Asia, where he also had fallen asleep by a river or lake or mountain stream, what have you, when he was on a journey towards enlightenment, and freaked out and ended up ripping out his eyelashes. And they actually say that because Buddha was considered so holy, that when his eyelash, each individual eyelash, touched the earth, it became a tea plant. The ancient Chinese had a whole different legend for this, which the other two are also spoken and are circulated, but this guy here up in the top corner in the ink drawing is Emperor Shenyang, who was said to be the second emperor. The first emperor was a dragon who gave fire. The second emperor, who's often pictured in a wonderful garment of leaves, he isn't here, but often he is seen barefoot with a garment of leaves, is said to have discovered the tea plant when he had set up a fire to boil some water, and he had used branches from a tea plant, and one of the leaves fell in his boiling water pot, and he said, "This is great," and it became tea. Okay, so on a more serious and a little less epic legend kind of way, there were actually really big scholars of tea, and this guy is sort of the father of tea, if you will, sort of the mastermind of tea. He was a Chinese tea scholar at the Chinese court, where tea had become very popular. He's the first one to kind of write down all the rituals surrounding tea, everything from how do we grow this plant, to what environment does it need, to what medicinal uses does it have, and how do we properly brew and make tea. He was very opinionated about his teas. I don't know if you've ever met somebody who takes their coffee specifically one way, but that is Lu Yu. He was very specific about teas. He actually got upset with some of the court ladies who'd been mixing their tea with plum sweeteners and flowers and sweet herbs, because to him, it should be drank the proper way, which is where you experience the bitterness of the tea. At this time, tea was actually brewed with salt. So it was not a sweetened beverage like we think of it now. And so he wrote the manual. He literally wrote the book on tea, which you can see here. It's still in circulation and in use. And it's actually what the British used to, after they stole tea from China, to figure out, how do we plant this? How are we going to grow this? How is this supposed to be made and done? And it's very weird because it's not written as formulaically as that sounds. It's written in a very poetic style. You will heat the water until the bubbles froth like fish eyes. It's very poetic and very gracefully written. And we actually have a copy, I believe, of it on checkout through Overdrive. So if you're interested, feel free. This is a statue of him. And in case you're wondering, why is there a statue of him in this tea garden? That's actually really common because after he died, he became considered the god of tea. And the wonky thing about this is when crops are good, they will present him with cups of brewed tea as the offering of this was a good harvest. When times are bad, they boil a kettle of water and they'll pour it over the top of the statue as kind of a, hey, we could use some extra help this tea season. So he's actually still really sort of the father of tea. This guy is one of the first sort of Buddhist monks, what have you, that was known for tea as he was going back and forth between China and Japan. Like I said before, tea traveled via Buddhist monks and also via marriages, but we'll get into that later. And this guy, who is a Buddhist and Zen monk named Esai, is really famous for bringing tea and its cultivation to Japan. He's actually the one that's credited with it. And the story is he meets Shogun Minamoto, who is this grand warrior who's suffering from either a stomach illness or a hangover, possibly both, and cured him with brewed tea. And Esai is introduced into some of the higher echelons of society by the shogun. Tea becomes a court drink. As it becomes more popular and easy to get, it still stays as a very high-class beverage, though it becomes a ceremony. It becomes very religious because it was brought in, quite literally, by religion. So the Buddhist kind of meditation or the Zen meditation with tea becomes and evolves into some of the Taoist beliefs that were local to there, and it becomes a religious or society ceremony. As we can see here with this lovely lady, she is engaging in a Japanese tea ceremony. It's extremely formal, and it's a process where one has to put all of the tools in the right places. You have to place your guest. I don't know if anybody's ever heard the saying, don't talk religion or politics at the table. Anybody familiar with that? Well, that's actually where this comes from. It was a rule of the Japanese tea ceremony that you don't talk religion or politics at the table. It's all to be pleasant conversation. It's all to be very kind of casual, and it's supposed to play into the beauty of the tea service. And at this point, green tea was made into a powder, which they called matcha, and it was frothed with a tiny bamboo whisk along with the hot water to make the tea. And this actually became such a huge trend that wealthy Japanese people had a separate tea house to have their tea ceremonies in, which typically faced a really well-organized garden. Okay, so how is tea moving around? If anybody's ever had to move your houseplants, it's a little bit of a challenge, yes? So how is this large plant or shrub moving around the world? So the answer is tins with loose leaf tea, like we drink now, or like you can buy at the store now, seeds, which are actually how it disseminated throughout India and parts of East Asia and Japan. The working spaces we're going to talk about when we get to the British, and that's a much later technology. Bricks of it, as you can see here, where it was concentrated into basically a cake and then bound together very tightly. You would snap one of those off, brew part of it, and you could brew that multiple times. That's the idea of weak tea. Okay. And this actually was a currency in ancient China because the further you get from the capital, the more tea is worth. Paper money in the country, not worth anything. These bricks of tea, though, currency. And when we talk about the American Revolution and the Boston Tea Party, this is actually what they were throwing chests of into the harbor. It wasn't loose leaf tea floating around. It was these concentrated bricks of tea. They also at one point tried to transport tea in barrels. Not the best plan. Okay, so we often think of the British when we think of tea because it's this ceremony that's at 4 p.m. It's this meal. it's thought of as very classy, but there aren't actually any British species of tea. Most of their versions of tea, if you've heard of English breakfast or even an Irish breakfast or, that kind of thing, they're blends. They're blends of herbals, they're blends of black tea and assam and other strong teas. So the interesting thing about this is the Chinese were super insular culture, but they also wanted a little bit of trade. So they established a little port island city called Canton, where the foreigners were allowed to come in and access and trade with them, but they weren't allowed to go into China mainland proper. So at this point, the Portuguese are kind of the first people to get there. They start trading for tea. So when Catherine of Braganza, who's this Portuguese princess, marries Charles II in the late 1600s, she brings tea with her because she likes her afternoon cuppa. And she brings a chest of tea with her. Does she bring a chest of tea into this marriage? She brings an entire port city as her dowry. So imagine that you are, talking about marrying someone, and they say, yes, well, if you marry me, you get an entire port. It's a little astounding now, but it was a very big reality then. So she brought Bombay, India, their port, into the marriage with her and brought tea into English society. And it became massively popular amongst the very elite because it's super expensive, because there isn't a massive amount of trade from the Chinese. So as time goes on, the Portuguese continue selling tea to the British, and then the Dutch get in on the Chinese trade and say, okay, we're fine with just coming to this island and trading you for tea. That's completely fine. The Dutch India Company is buying tea and trading it to the British for a huge markup. Okay? And it was literally so pricey in England at this point that it was kept in a locked chest by the lady of the house who had a key, or her lady's maid. And this is actually the origin of the tea caddy. This is an early tea caddy here that we're seeing right here. So the British, they're getting a little bit grouchy because tea has become massively popular over the 18th century. And they want to get in on the trade for themselves. So what do? A spice company called the British East India, or if we've heard of it in another term, Bloody Jack, becomes one of the main trading things with China. So originally, the Chinese weren't so fond of doing some trade with the British, but they were willing to do it because the British had invaded and colonized India, and Indian opium was much more potent than Chinese opium. So your sailors or your pirates or what have you would trade with the locals. I have some opium, you have some tea, let's trade. This blows up, okay? This gets huge because Indian opium becomes massively popular with the Chinese. So the reason why it's triangle trade is because they're trading, the British grow the opium in India, or they say they grow, it's really grown by the native Indian population and then sold by the British. And then it moves, they move the opium to China, they trade the opium for Spanish silver because that's the only currency the Chinese will accept. And then they trade the Spanish silver for tea. This goes on for a while. It keeps continuing to go well until about the time of Victoria. And the problem begins that the emperor is not exactly pro-opium. In fact, he bans it. As you can see here, this is a Chinese opium den. And this had become a huge addiction. It had disabled a lot of the working populace and caused a lot of problems. Just as we have the modern opioid epidemic, they had issues with the Chinese opium dens, so the emperor said, no more of this, and had his ministers basically throw out all of this really expensive opium into the sea. Now, people still wanted opium, so they were trying to get it off the black market, but the British decided there's an easier way to get our opium in, and that is we make them. This begins the First Opium War, and the British invade. They have better weapons, they have more modern weapons, and they force the Chinese into some really sucky trade agreements, including multiple port cities. Hong Kong originally was a port city that they used to trade for opium, and the British didn't actually give back Hong Kong until the 1980s. As we can see here, there are some very British young ladies enjoying a nice cup of tea. The Countess of Bedford, who was one of Queen Victoria's ladies in waiting, was actually the first person to really have that 4 p.m. tea meal that we think about now, because she liked a good pick-me-up in the middle of the day, and it became massively popular. And tea was considered an acceptable beverage for ladies, so ladies could go out to these tea houses later on and be in public. It was still very much an upper crust beverage, but as it got cheaper, it spreads throughout the population, and eventually part of servants' wages at this point was a tea allowance. They got so much tea to get by. Now, like we were talking about earlier with Linnaeus, naming things, botany, understanding plants and animals, this was just kind of coming around the bend, and it was just barely thought of as an actual job by this point. So, early on, the British, they were having that issue with trying to get Chinese tea. So they look around India and they're trying to find, does India have any tea itself? And the answer is yes, it does, which is Assam. Now, Assam had been there a while, and Robert Bruce, who was this military gentleman and also a botanist, goes up into the mountains, makes friends with the local Singpho chief, which is a tribe that has a language with a name for every plant, tree, shrub. It's very precise. And discovers Assam and sends the plant back, and the English botanists basically say, no, this isn't tea. This is similar, but it's not tea. Different species. And it doesn't really take a boom until his brother, a long bit later, who was also military, and that's why he was stationed in India, sends it again to the botany planters in England, and they say, yes, actually, this is tea. And Assam becomes a huge tea crop. It's not considered as high class as Chinese tea, but it's still a massive thing. And they are often credited with the discovery of tea, but in India, but quite frankly, the Singpho and other native tribes knew it was there for a very long time. And actually, the Indian name for tea is chai. So if you've ever had masala chai or something of that nature, it comes from this plant. So, are green tea and black tea different? Linnaeus thinks yes. Linnaeus is wrong. They are the same plant. How on earth do they figure out that these are the same plant? They send a spy to China, which is closed off at this point, to figure out, how do we get tea plants? Robert Fortune is literally there to steal tea. And he's not that great of a spy. He succeeds, but he's not that great of a spy. While he's there, he figures out that China has been selling them very green tea. And he looks at the native teas that are brewed and goes, they're not this green. What's the difference? They had been putting chemicals in it to color the tea, which actually contained arsenic or mercury. So they were using a dye that was actually somewhat toxic. This is Robert Fortune. Probably the world's not the best spy. So Robert Fortune bribes his way into China, hires on a bunch of Chinese assistants, and he does try very badly to pass as a Chinese gentleman. As you can see by the photo, it was not necessarily convincing, especially to the mainland Chinese people. And he goes in, and he and his assistants bribe and barter and cause trouble all across China as he travels, and he publishes lots of grandiose travel memoirs about this later. And he secures tea plants several times. He makes 2 or 3 of these journeys. The first time he sends tea plants back, they die. Half of the seeds die. So the second time he uses these things called Wardian cases, which were big development at the day. If you've ever seen a terrarium, it looks like that, except on a long stick. And some of them live, but when they try to put them in the tea gardens in Assam, which is an actual region in India, it doesn't work because it's super humid and jungle and hot, and it doesn't have the drainage the Chinese tea plants need. Eventually, one of the people who was brought in as a colonizer and a military captain to India gets settled in the Darjeeling region, and they succeed in growing the tea plants there, which is where we get Darjeeling tea from. It's considered the champagne of teas. It's a very fine tea. It sells for a ridiculous amount of money. But Robert Fortune was the guy who was responsible for stealing tea and bringing it, so to speak, the plant itself into more British hands and making it a lot easier. So by this point, late 18th century, and this was a little bit earlier than Robert Fortune, Americans come to the colonies, they settle. You know, we all know the Plymouth story and all of that. We get into the Revolutionary War era, and just before the Revolutionary War, the locals needed help fighting the Native Americans because people, well, if someone's colonizing your home, the Native Americans did what was, I beg your pardon, they fought the invaders, which were the Pilgrims or the Englishmen, what have you. And so after this huge, expensive war that the British come in and bring their troops to try and defend the colonists, which we call the French and Indian War, the British decide to up their tax on tea because tea's a necessity, but it's also somewhat of a luxury good. So they up the price on it, and they up the taxes to pay for the French and Indian War, which was to defend their colonists. That didn't go over so well. At that point, I've seen a lot of comparisons where they compare tea at that point to Wi-Fi now, and Wi-Fi has become such an integral necessity for life that it's very difficult to live without it. Well, this starts the idea of there being taxed for tea, a ridiculous markup, and they're not being represented in the British Congress. So we get no taxation without representation, and the Sons of Liberty throwing chests of tea overboard. And this is literally those bricks that we saw earlier. This is millions of dollars of tea. This is a massive amount of good destruction. So tea in the American psyche, we start drinking Liberty teas, which are basically herbal to saints. It's a bunch of local herbs and some imported herbs mixed together. People start drinking coffee or chocolate much more often, or alcohols, beers, ales, because those represent liberty and American freedom, versus tea, which became a representation of the British. So tea trade slows a lot down at this point in the States. Now, Robert Fortune, later in his life, actually tried to bring tea plants or a tea crop to the United States, but that effort failed. Okay, so from there, it continues with imperialism and wars over tea. The Opium Wars continue, and the Chinese Empire starts to fall, mostly because if you have a bunch of invaders controlling your port cities, it's a lot harder to trade and money, especially when, hey, we can produce fine Chinese teas in the middle of India. You know, it's not an exclusive resource anymore. Okay, so there are 4 main types of tea that come from those 2 plants that we talked about, which are the same species, but they're different subspecies. So Camellia sinensis, or Camellia sinensis var. Assam. We get green tea, black tea, white tea, yellow tea, oolong, and pu'er, which are the main recognized types of tea from this one plant. In a second, Leah is going to actually talk about some of the differences. And they also, on this picture, list flavored teas and herbal teas. Here's the thing. A lot of tea snobs don't consider flavored teas and herbal teas actual tea. They're tea blends, they're tea mixes. Okay, so how do we get from this beautiful, gorgeous green plant to the tiny leaves in our cup? Well, the answer is it's a major industry, just like any other agricultural crop. So it gets picked. Darjeeling leaves actually get picked every 7 days to get the right liquor or the right kind of taste or brewed tea, if you will. It's not actually alcoholic. It's called liquor, though, because it's what's in your cup, it's what's brewed. And they pick the tea, and then it's left in a building to wither for a little bit. Now, the longer it's left to wither, the more it oxidizes, or you'll often see the word ferment. Again, not alcoholic, but it oxidizes, and that changes the flavor of the tea. I like to think that it deepens it, but I also like dark teas like black tea, which are a bit more caffeinated. Then the tea leaves get dried or fired. In the original, really old Chinese process, sometimes the tea leaves would be toasted in a pan over a fire, but nowadays it is much more modern with drying machines, and it takes a very precise amount of time to dry tea. Again, in Darjeeling, it takes 23 minutes precisely to dry a batch of Darjeeling tea, unless it's the rainy season, monsoon season, and then it takes 26 precisely, no more, no less. Okay. On occasion, you will see rolled teas where the tea leaf has been rolled and shaped. So if you're drinking a circular tea, someone has actually taken the leaf and rolled it into a mold form by hand to give it, which is part of the reason why it's expensive. The teas are then sorted into different types, not meaning like green or black or whatever like that, meaning the leaf. Is it a whole leaf? Is it a rolled leaf? Is it a broken leaf? Is it parts of the leaf? Is it twigs and stems? Is it, just tea dust at the very bottom? And those then get sorted and separated from one another. Now, we think of wine as being this very expert thing, that different people have a certain taste palette for wine and they can tell what's good or what might pair well with something else. And they're often called sommeliers. Well, turns out tea has its own sommeliers. And a lot of tea plantations hire someone who is specifically a taster of, and they will rank where that tea stands. Is it the finest grade? Next up to the finest? Is it just okay? Is it, passable, etc.? And there's a specific ranking system for that, but you can think about it like how we're graded in school. It's basically similar to how they grade these teas. It is then packed and ready for shipping. But here's the thing, sometimes tea goes to auction, meaning that whole chests of tea will be sold, or whole shipments of tea rather, will be sold for a specific amount of money. And that can actually drive a lower quality tea up in price because people get caught up in the excitement of bidding, so they might actually pay more for a lower quality tea. Now, that isn't as frequent at this point today, and some of the more fine establishments or places that are very well known for a high standard, such as Buckingham Palace, they will probably order their tea directly from the tea plantation or the tea factory rather than going to auction or trying to buy it off the shelf. Also, if you've heard of Twinings, Twinings actually was one of the first tea brands that would sell to women. So women actually got out of the house and bought Twinings tea because it was high quality, it was respectable, and it was considered something of a lady's beverage. So that actually opened the door for tea houses, for women having tea parties, and for it becoming a very big social ritual. And there are a lot of arguments over whether you should eat snacks with tea or what certain foods one should eat with tea. And it even gets into how people brew their tea, which is very specific. So in Japan, we still get the powdered matcha teas that are put together with the bamboo rod and stirred. In other places, like the American South, we will get sweet tea. In Britain, they borrowed this custom from the Dutch of putting milk and sugar in their tea. That is actually not considered generally socially acceptable in China and Japan. You're supposed to drink the tea on its own for the flavor, for the value of it, for the spiritual kind of experience that one gets from drinking tea. Tea in Iran and in Persia, or places of what was once Persia, oftentimes they will hold a sugar cube in the mouth and drink more bitter teas and filter it through the sugar cube. In ancient China, there were actually people who the young man would send the young lady's parents tea, and if they drank the tea, it was a marriage contract accepted. If they sent the tea back, it was a marriage rejected. So it was a form of proposal. Tea has a myriad of different methods, and there are actually a lot of ways to purchase tea. One of them that I found out about a little while ago was Houston actually has a tea festival. We do, and a local tea growing industry, which is amazing. And we found this out through talking with Trishna Teas, because they were selling at a farmer's market, and they actually produce, and a lot of places in Texas produce some really great high quality loose leaf teas. They're also local. So that is an option if you're interested. Keep in mind, in Texas, we're also starting to grow yapon tea, which yapon isn't tea in the Sinensis family at all. As far as I'm aware, it is a plant that is native to North America and our only native source of caffeine. So with that, Leah, if you would, teach us, now that we know the history behind tea and truly appreciate the beverage in our cups, Leah, would you teach us how to brew the perfect beverage?
All right, I will try my best. Okay, so it's not quite as complicated as it sounds. I know you can go through all of the rituals and everything are super interesting, but you know, when you're brewing a regular cup of coffee, most of us are not going to go through all those rituals. I certainly am not. Although I have, you know, had tea parties with, you know, family and friends, you know, trying to follow all the etiquette rules and all that kind of stuff just for the fun of it. But I can say right now, we probably did not do it right. We tried, but failed miserably. It was still fun. But all right, so can you go to the next slide for me since I don't have, okay. So Rachel touched on the different types of tea, and yes, there are 4 main types of tea. And then the last one is actually what we think of as herbal teas are not technically teas. They're called tisanes in French. But they are not actual teas. And those are what I drink the most, actually, is probably more of the herbal tea because I don't do caffeine. So those are different herbs, and you can actually make those out of just about anything. That's where you can dry your basil, and you can make basil. You can put basil in teas. You can use peels from lemons and oranges and all that kind of stuff. Like, so when you go to Tivana, a lot of their teas were probably more of the herbal teas or mixes. So I'm just say right now, I am not a tea scholar, especially after learning all of that. I'm like, oh, I had no idea. Anyway, okay, so each type of tea kind of has different recommendations on how to brew it. But like I said, it's not quite as complicated. And from what I've read, a lot of teas are very forgiving, and it's really a matter of your own personal taste. As Rachel mentioned, some people put, certain cultures put milk and honey and sugar and all that in their tea, and others, of course, do not. But it's really up to you, however you like your tea. And how long you brew it also kind of affects how it's going to taste, the strength of it or whatnot. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. All right, so we've all heard about many benefits of different types of teas. And depending on what you're looking for, as far as a benefit goes, you probably want to do a little bit of research on your tea. And it also probably depends on how sensitive you are to different herbs. Benefits of tea include, you can see a whole list here, increases your energy. Certain teas help your heart, cleans out toxins. I don't know if anybody ever tried to do a detox tea. Some are super strong and they can really mess up your stomach, while others are more gentle. So you want to make sure that if you're looking for a type of tea for benefits of some sort, you really do your research on it. And in some cases, your doctor or somebody who is into the more natural medicines, and they might be able to provide a little bit of guidance, because it can be a little overwhelming. Kind of like if you're into natural remedies or sorry, drawing a blank. My brain's not all there at the moment. Essential oils, which the teas have essential oils in it. So that's another reason. So when you're brewing your tea, it kind of, depending on the quality of the tea, the essential oils are coming out in your tea, and that's what's going to help you. All right, next slide, please. All right, so bag tea versus loose leaf tea. I'm a big fan of loose leaf tea. It has more benefits. As Rachel mentioned, sometimes there are different types of bags, and if you carefully looking at your bag that you use, a lot of it is made out of what they call dust. You know, I've read a comparison about tea bags being like potato chips. At the bottom of the bag is all the broken up potato chips at the bottom, and yeah, the flavor's still there, but you know, they're small and they're just not as good. You don't enjoy it as much. So when you're looking at your tea bags, you can kind of think of them in that way. So you have your loose leaf tea, which is just what it describes as loose leaf. You would scoop it and put it in some sort of filter to brew it. And then you also have what we call like the triangle bags, which have more space in it. And those are loose leaf teas. They're just usually in some sort of special bag, and it looks like a triangle, and it allows the water to penetrate better and like mix a little bit different than it would, say, with a regular square bag. So there's also not the ones in the picture here, but there's just square bags. They don't have the string. Those are another one that are pretty good as far as quality goes. It also allows the water to seep a little bit better and absorb. So those are usually slightly higher quality. Then you have your regular tea bags that are all the dust, like the one in the picture here on your right. And that's just your regular tea bag, which has the dust at the bottom, we'll call it. But you can, I mean, like I said, it is really up to you whether or not you like a flavor of a tea or not. The loose leaf tea just usually has a richer flavor. It has more nutrients and minerals, and it generally just tastes, I think it tastes a little bit better, but like I said, it depends on your personal taste. So let's move on. Next one. Thank you. Okay, so brewing strategies. This is, like I said, not as complicated as it sounds. Most teas are going to come with, so, you know, if you get it in a box or if you get a loose leaf tea, they usually have a recommendation of the temperature that you need to put your tea on to brew it, and how long to let it steep. And usually, yeah, so they're going to have recommendations. So you can follow those recommendations, and this usually makes it pretty easy. So these are some strategies that you might want to keep in mind if you don't have those recommendations on your box. But you want to make sure that your water is of good quality. So you can put your water in the microwave and then put your tea bag in it, and it's going to be totally fine. You can brew it as long as you want. Let it seep there and absorb, depending on how strong you want your tea to be. And it'll turn out fine. You can add whatever else you want. However, it's not going to taste as good. And I've actually experimented with this. I don't know if anybody else has tried that to see what the comparison is. And yeah, but brewing it in using a teapot is just going to make a world of difference. Another thing that makes a world of difference is the water that you use. So I actually used to get in arguments with my family members about the water that they use to make their coffee. I would purchase a big water jug and put a pump on it, and I would not drink the tap water because it has, especially Houston, we have kind of chlorine-y water. It's what they have to put in it to make the water clean, but it affects the flavor of the water. And so I finally talked them into trying the water that I got from the grocery store, the filtered water, and they noticed a huge difference in their taste of their coffee. And as you know, coffee is sometimes a lot stronger. So if you can taste the difference in coffee, then you're going to definitely be able to taste the difference in your teas. So you want to make sure that you're wanting a good flavor, that you use good water. Didn't think of that before, but when I finally figured it out, I was like, it's a huge difference in the flavor of your tea. So different ways of brewing. You can do the super easy, quick, pop it in the microwave, put your tea bag in. Totally fine. The is to pour hot water glass and let the leaves sink to the bottom before drinking. So you actually wouldn't filter them out. You just let it sink and you let it brew. You can filter them out later if you want, because I know most of us don't like to drink the leaves, but you can just let them go to the bottom and then you just wouldn't drink that part. The second part is you can pour hot water over the leaves in and then you can pour it later into a mug. So you have the regular second one, you just put it in your cup, the leaves in the cup, and pour hot water over it. Or you can do the same strategy pretty much in the kettle. And then, of course, the most accurate way is the Chinese way, and that's to steep it in the kettle. And then you pour it in the serving bowl, and then you slowly mix the tea. I kind of picture people doing that like you would with wine before drinking it. And that's the most recommended. Of course, that's going to take you a little bit more time. So I don't know about anybody else, but my strategy usually is pouring just hot water over my tea leaves, not in a separate container. And I'll show you a couple of containers that I actually use. So my favorite container, I don't know if anybody can, okay, let me go over this one part first, and then I'll show you the containers that I use. Oh, thank you. Okay, So I don't know if everybody can see my screen or not. Can you spotlight me? Anyway, this is my favorite container to use. I got it from Teavana. What you do is you measure out your tea leaves, you stick it in there, and then you just pour your hot water over it and you let it steep for whatever amount of time. And then this little is really nifty. You put it on top of your cup. So this is a single cup serving. You would put it on top of your cup. So you can use something similar to this. I mean, you have your standard tea things, or I have this one where you can do pretty much the same thing. You put your tea leaves in and then you just put it in your water and you let it steep. I have a couple different versions of it. So these are pretty easy ways to do it. And then I also have a very fancy teapot here. This is the cast iron kind, and inside, if I wanted to make a whole pot, I would just put my tea leaves in this mesh thing and then set it in there, pour the hot water in, and let it steep for whatever amount of time. Now, as far as your containers go that you use to put your tea in, it does actually make a difference. Cast iron and clay is going to absorb the tea flavor. So if you have a tendency to make a very strong tea, like say, I don't know, I think jasmine tea kind of has a bitter flavor to it. If you like jasmine tea and you make jasmine tea, then this pot, clay or cast iron, is going to kind of absorb that flavor. So when you brew a different type of tea, you're going to have kind of that leftover flavor to it. So usually I think glass is recommended. So if you have your regular teapot, of course, if you don't put your leaves in it, it's not to absorb those flavors. So that's why I usually brew my tea separately in my teapot and then use my little cup thing. And this one, it's plastic. I haven't noticed too big of a difference as far as absorbing the flavor of the teas that I drink the most out of this, which I happen to like chai or the herbal teas that I like. So just keep that in mind when you're brewing, to make sure that you're going to brew it or steep it in something that's not going to absorb the flavor as much, to keep the flavors the best. All right, can you put the last slide back up? Now, if you don't have directions on your teapot, you can always look this up too. Like, you can probably find this online just about anywhere. But these are the temperature recommendations and the times to steep your tea. As you can see, they're kind of similar, and again, it's personal taste. If you want stronger tea, let it steep longer. If you want it less, then you don't have to steep it as long. And if you like, for example, herbal teas, especially loose leaf teas, you can use a few times, like up to probably about 3 times. And while some people think it makes your tea weaker, that some teas are actually meant to be drunk like that. So the first time you drink it, a lot of people would throw it away because it's not supposed to be that strong. So it's not actually till the second or third time using those particular leaves that you get the real flavor of what the tea is supposed to look like. Of course, that, like I said, I like strong teas, so it's all a matter of opinion. So if you like your tea stronger, you can use the same the first time and then throw away your teas, or you can use it multiple times and try to get as much out of your tea as possible. That's about it. Anyway, so just main brewing tips are to avoid using the microwave. Your type of water matters. Try not to use the tap water, especially in Houston. And clay and cast iron pots take on the tea flavor, so keep that in mind when you're brewing. So if you'd like to try different types of teas, or you have a specific one, go ahead and use that same pot. It's not going to affect it as much. But if you like to switch it up, then you might want to consider using a different pot. And that's about it. So if you have any questions, let me know. Like I said, I'm not a tea scholar. I just like to experiment.
Okay, to be fair, thank you so much, Leah, because tea is very much a trial and error kind of thing, so it's really good to hear from someone who regularly drinks tea and brews and does it themselves. And I'm so jealous about your teapot. I want one of those so badly now. So to be honest with you guys, before this presentation, I loved drinking tea. I knew some things about the history of tea, but not as much as I do now. And actually, a lot of what I've learned for talking about this is from books that we have on Overdrive that you guys can check out. And I've listed some of them here. So Darjeeling for all the tea in China, if you really liked the Bad Spy story with Robert Fortune, that is actually a book entirely about him. History of the World in 6 Glasses goes through the 6 main types of beverages that sort of crafted the world. We have ones about the arts and brewing and serving of tea, as well as tea recipes. Personally, my new favorite is the really great tea called Death by Chocolate, and I think it's enormously delicious. And I'm really excited. We actually have some Yapon tea in the house, and I'm really excited to try that. Ooh, Shaheen is saying, and I'm going to exit here on the presentation. This will be up on the Life website if you want to check us out. Shaheen has said, grated fresh ginger with loose Darjeeling tea boiled in a small pan and add milk while boiling is delicious. And the traditional way tea is had in India. You can add some cloves and cinnamon for chai flavor. Thank you. Thank you, Shaheen, for being generous enough to share your recipe for tea. That is something that we will have to try.
When we use a teapot to brew our tea, are we supposed to warm the pot before we make the tea?
So it depends on which way you're making it. If you're making it according to that really traditional Chinese way, the answer is probably yes. You're supposed to warm the pot and the cup. And like Leah said, tossing out that first cup, it was actually really traditional in China to toss out that first cup because it was so very strong, because they were making it from those concentrated bricks of tea rather than a loose leaf or something like that we get now. It was extremely bitter. So the first cup of tea, they would say it's for the gods, or it's tea for your enemies, you know? So I'm not sure, though, in modern terms. Shaheen is saying you should warm the pot. What do you think, Leah?
Actually, that question I do not know the answer to. Yeah, that one I don't know. Sorry. I should look that up. But usually, I mean, most of us just put the pot on the kettle and, pot on the stove, turn on the thing, and then just wait for it. I don't even measure my temperature, to tell you the truth. So I'm just like, okay, it looks hot. It's making the very loud noise. It's ringing, so I know it's done. And then I just put it on. So there are some teas that I think it still tastes fine to me, but I know it could taste so much better if I was a little bit more careful with my strategy.
Shaheen is saying it is also the British way. I agree with that. The British also do that. At my house, we have an electric kettle. So we would pour our hot water onto our tea leaves, but that is not necessarily traditional. That's a little bit of a modern way to have your tea brewed. As far as tea goes, there are a lot of different tea houses, and hot and cold teas are both really popular here in Houston. Cold teas can include bubble tea. They can include sun tea. They include iced tea, which, to quote Dolly Parton, it's the house wine of the South. And actually, the thing that they recommend with iced tea is that you use twice as much of the leaf or of the tea bags than you would with a hot tea, because the ice waters it down pretty quick. My mom was a big fan of making sun tea, where you would sweeten it and then leave it out in the sun in a sealed container. Don't want mosquitoes in your tea, in a sealed container, and let the sun heat the tea and disseminate the sugar through it. So there's a million ways to drink this beverage, and they're all pretty tasty depending on what your preference is. So
I found it interesting. I found it interesting that when you showed the temperatures to brew all the teas, hardly any of them went as high as boiling. And I've heard that
Yeah.
don't boil it because it gets the air, the oxygen out of the water.
Mhm.
And it's a better tea with water that has not been at a full boil.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
And one of the funny things is about the tea is that setting your tea out and letting it ferment turns it into kombucha.
Which you can also buy that pre-made. And we are at 11 o'clock right now. So thank you so much, Leah, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And some people throw 3 bags of black tea in 1 cup. You really like it strong, Gina. And I had a lot of fun learning about tea. And next week, we are actually going to be learning from Deanna West, our circulation manager, about do-it-yourself self-care products. So do-it-yourself spa day. So come and enjoy some fantastic spa products with us next week, same time, same WebEx, and we will see you then.
Thank you.
Alrighty, guys. You can also put tea cozies on things. Noted.